started when I was a child, my fascination with autobiography. So, like many of you, my otherwise happy childhood was interrupted by my parents' divorce. And it was all very confusing. Why was my father sleeping across town? Why did he pick me up on Friday afternoons, take me to his apartment, bring me back to my mother's on Sunday, and was it all my fault? Well, I asked my parents, but all their answers seemed perfunctory. So a few years later, still bothered by the situation, I sat down and wrote about it. And vetting my confusion really helped put things in perspective. I was so proud of my 2-page narrative that I decided to share it. My mother dismissed it with a grimace. My father looked like he wanted to cry, but praised my searing insight. And my aunts, uncles, and cousins who'd gathered for a family barbecue might have applauded or ridiculed my efforts, but my mother snatched the pages from my hands before I could read them. Boy, you need to stop showing that story to everybody. Clearly, I had crossed a line. So disheartened, I retreated into silence, filling my insatiable appetite for narrative with as many biographies as I could find in our local library on the edge of South Central. There was Mark Twain and Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. I spent an entire summer obsessed with Helen Keller. No, really. I mean, born into an affluent Southern family at the end of the 19th century and rendered deaf and blind before her 2nd birthday by a bout with scarlet fever before she could speak, sit properly at the dinner table, learn to respect her parents or the good Negroes who served them. Fast forward to Helen's 7th year of life and enter Annie Sullivan, savior, teacher, beam of light. Unlike Helen, Annie is an orphan who has grown up in a rundown asylum where she's described her biggest adventure as playing with the rats she and her brother turned into pets. Well, assisted by her beloved teacher, Helen learns to sit properly at the dinner table, wipe the sticky corners of her mouth with a linen napkin, and as the world has come to know, to read, write, eventually to speak, she becomes an advocate for millions of people with disabilities and a world-renowned lecturer and activist. Helen Keller was inspiring, okay? I mean, these were the kinds of stories that I was drawn to into adolescence. Stories of individuals who overcame great odds, who served as testaments to the tenacity of the human spirit. I lived vicariously through the courage of those characters. I was aware, of course, that, well, save the occasional biography about Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, or Booker T. Washington, the large majority of the people in these books were white, but so were most celebrities in the media. And like every person of color growing up in America in the 60s, I was accustomed to projecting my experience through characters of African descent. That said, I longed to read the stories I heard around the dinner table about my father hauling coal in his red wagon through the streets of Indianapolis at the age of 8, about my grandmother serving dinners of dandelion soup. I had certainly never read the story of my great-great-great-grandfather on my mother's side, who was tied to the mast of a slave ship and marked his passage by etching notches into the wood by the tiny glint of sunlight streaming through floorboards. I longed to read about my kin who survived the reality of racial and economic oppression and how many without formal educations had become landowners and merchants when banks had systematically denied black folks access to loans. I mean, how had they done that? At 14, I stumbled upon a little book entitled Soul on Ice. And stumbled upon is inaccurate. My 8th grade English teacher, Mrs. Orenstein, was actually quite impressed with my astute reading of The Naked Ape by Desmond Morris, a book which made the compelling argument that much of our behavior, our need to make war, reproduce, hunt, jockey for affection is related to our nature as primates. Mrs. Ornstein was so impressed by my book report that she constructed a bibliography just for me, my own personal reading list. And she must have sensed my hunger to read, to know, to see, to hear about people who look like me. Because Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver was at the top of that list. His story was very different than the ones I heard around my dinner table. I mean, more than a chronicle of the injustices against black people in America, Cleaver's autobiographical essays were a call for collective action. And in some ways, they represented the very people my parents sought to isolate me from. Cleaver was not interested in building bridges. He was hell-bent on tearing them down. But his writing disturbed me for another reason. I mean, Mrs. Ornstein didn't know. She couldn't know that I was struggling, that on a daily basis, I was being bullied by the very boys I found secretly attractive. She couldn't have known that outside of her classroom, where I found solace in classic literature, I was fighting for my life. In one of his most scathing essays, Cleaver reduced my most intimate feelings to whiteness, pathology, and defined them as counter-revolutionary. And I wasn't sure where that left me. Anxious to know where her gift had landed after several weeks, Mrs. Ornstein finally asked, "Does the author's experience resonate for you?" I wasn't sure what the word resonate meant, but it seemed important to her. So I smiled, nodded, and said, "Uh-huh." It was the first and last time Mrs. Ornstein loaned me a book. Once again, I retreated into silence, essentially putting my soul on ice. It seemed that each and every time I attempted to share my experience, or even to find it reflected in a literature that purported to speak for me, so I stopped looking. I stopped looking for my story, and I stopped telling it to family, friends. And maybe the most devastating thing of all is that I stopped telling it to myself. Although I demonstrated some vocation as a writer by this time, I decided to major in biology. I mean, after all, The Naked Ape had resonated for me. And there was something about the economy of quantitative data. I didn't have to feel one way or another about it. I'm sure good scientists are emotionally invested in their work, but I wasn't a good scientist, okay? And I was working after school to save for college and preparing for the SATs and graduating and heading off to the high desert to college, the first in my family to do so. And I definitely did not want to think about what that meant, the burden of that. And there were so many stars in the desert. And there was calculus and biochemistry and physics and the smell of sage after the morning rain and parties and calculus again, and trying to get a handle on the opposite sex, any sex, and dreams and negotiating blackness in a predominantly white setting, and Jimmy's eyes, and my unconscious mind working, always working overtime, and psychology, and observing the strange and fascinating behavior of rhesus monkeys, and psychology, and statistics, and genetics, and walking stoned in the desert, and expanding, and wow, that really seemed counterproductive. Weed seemed counterproductive, caused me to question everything, to feel counter-revolutionary. No matter how fast I ran during the day, the night was... I left the desert, moved to the ocean. Not a great plan. But in my isolation and exhaustion, I started to write, chronicling dreams, desires, pent-up feelings about my mother, my father, myself. It was around this time that I discovered Langston Hughes and Audre Lorde and Blackberry and Pat Parker and Sylvester and James Baldwin and a very good therapist, and begun to put things in perspective. I mean, there were actually a whole lot of people of African descent who shared my experience. Kindred, who wrote, sang, and celebrated their lives, our lives. At 22, a friend invited me to a production of For Colored Girls Who've Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough by Ntozake and I witnessed the full-bodied black women I had known all my life for the first time on stage. The ladies in red, blue, green, yellow, brown, purple, and orange dancing across that raked platform at ACT in San Francisco were my mother, my aunts, sister, nieces. They were the same women who smoked Salems while pressing kinky heads of hair, baking sweet potato pies, and sometimes single-handedly raising 5, 6 children. Ntozake's characters were the same women I loved and disappointed and admired, and seeing their lives emblazoned across that stage gave me the courage to imagine staging my own. My stories would marinate another decade in smoky cafes, writing workshops, open mic poetry readings. This was before slams, okay? I would share them with contemporaries like Joe Beam, Essex Hemphill, Marlon Riggs, all gay men of African descent, committed to witnessing our trials and tribulations through a pandemic that threatened to erase us from the map and revising the narrative that excluded and misrepresented our experiences in African American as well as mainstream literature. In November of 1990, Brian Freeman asked me to write and perform a piece about my life for a show he'd slated at a little venue called Josie's Juice Joint and Cabaret in San Francisco. I took a deep breath and accepted. And when he asked if I knew another courageous brother who might round out a trio, I suggested Eric Gupton. Together we became the Pomos, short for Pomo Afro Homos, short for postmodern African American. You know the rest. And we would tour the US, the UK, and Canada to critical acclaim. Our mission was simple: address the absence of three-dimensional black gay characters in the theater and deconstruct and redefine popular myths about our lives. We wrote and embodied stories embodied by our own experience, and our shows became collective testimonies. As they spoke to the historical absence of our voices in contemporary American drama, they became like For Colored Girls, representative and iconic at once. And unwittingly, we became activists. My life as a Pomo forged my work not only as an artist, but as an educator. So I spent the better part of the past 20 years developing curriculum that invites students to mount and perform their own stories. The young black woman negotiating her strict Muslim upbringing in a liberal arts setting. The trans student coming to terms with gender identity. The young white guy questioning the role of race and class for the first time in his privileged life. My goal in the classroom studio is always identifying and vetting each individual's authentic voice. The journey is nerve-wracking, surprising, terrifying, rewarding, and ultimately liberating. Not only for the writer-performer, but often for entire communities who, quite unexpectedly, find themselves reflected in one person's story. That, in my experience, is the power of autobiography. Thank you.